What's up, control freaks, and welcome to the 60th episode of the Control Freak podcast. I am your host, LessAlex, and today I have on a very special guest, the Lotus Control Master himself, to share his vast knowledge of the deck. It is none other than Patrick Wu. Patrick, how's it going?
Hi, I'm doing well. How about you?
Oh, I'm pretty good. No complaints other than I lost my win in at the RCQ today, but other than that, I'm fine. Before we get started though, we got the housekeeping to get out of the way. I promise I will try and go as fast as possible so we can get down to the nitty-gritty of it. But yeah, before we delve into the mind of Patrick's and learn about Lotus Control, I first want to give a huge shout out and say thank you to all of my new amazing patrons over at patreon.com/LessAlex. Giacomo Spadoni, John, Helipolos 10, Justin Howard, Cam Ogle, Rafael Diaz Heredia, Iron Man, Philippe Almedea, Chris Earl, Marc-Andre Tremblay, and none other than Patrick Wu. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you to all of the other amazing patrons. If you enjoy the podcast and you would like to support the content directly, you can do so for less than $1 an episode by heading over to patreon.com/LessAlex. Every patron will receive an awesome Control Freak sticker along with other perks based on which level you would like to support at. And I just posted my Patreon exclusive sideboard guide to my build of Azorius Control, which I will be updating week to week and changing the deck list as I see, I would like it to change. And you can gain access to that at the very lowest tier over there on patreon.com/LessAlex. And even if you just like the content, you don't need the deck list or the sideboard guide, consider becoming a patron. It really is the best way to support the content directly. And as a reminder, the podcast can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, Stitcher, basically wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure to head on over to Apple Podcasts and Spotify to give them 5-star reviews, say a couple kind words about the podcast, and I will mention it on the podcast when you do, and I'll read out your review. Make sure to check out my Quiet Speculation pieces over on quietspeculation.com. This coming week, I'll be playing Lotus Combo, not Lotus Control, but Lotus Combo there. So be on the lookout for that. And if you want to chop it up with me in a more casual way, you can follow me over on Twitter at LessAlex over there. And don't forget to join the Discord. It's free. It's open. There is a special part for patrons, but the Discord itself is open. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. We are streaming this live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. Thank you, everybody. All right, let's get past the housekeeping. All right, Patrick, you ready to get into it?
Yeah.
All righty. So before we get started, I do want to just list off some of your accomplishments here. We've got 3 Pro Tour appearances, 2 RC top 8s, both being back-to-back with Jeskai Control and Standard, and now Blue-White Lotus Control and Pioneer in the most recent Toronto face-to-face games tournament. 3 face-to-face open top 8s, 1 face-to-face open win, 1 MTGO Modern Champs. And you have a ton others here. That's where I'm gonna stop myself before I go too deep. But yeah, safe to say you are pretty good at the game of Magic of the Gathering. So what is your background? And getting into that, how did you start playing Control?
So I really, my first deck actually wasn't Blue-White Control. It was actually a Boggles without Boggles deck. So instead of Boggles in Modern, I played Thrun, the Last Troll, in Geist of St. Traft. So it's kind of like a thick Boggles deck. That quickly I quickly realized that
You
deck was not going anywhere.
you learn the error of your ways.
Yeah, and then there was actually this. He goes by the name on MTGO, IVC. It's an Italian player. He was also in the recent PT. He did very well with Jeskai Control on day one and kind of slipped away in day two. But he had like a very interesting list where I really liked it. It had like Dragon Lord Ojutai, Ojutai's Command, Jace Vryn's Prodigy, and just like a bunch of like cool interactions.
Oh yeah.
So that was the first blue-white control deck that I played, and
That's a standard deck?
no, that was in modern actually.
Oh, Ojutai in modern? Holy smokes. Okay. That's cool though.
It was with Minamo and all that, and then
Oh yeah, I remember that.
eventually, I fell in love with blue-white in general just because of how it has a fighting chance against every matchup, and you can always tune it to your favorite depending on what you want to beat.
Oh yeah.
And then War of the Spark came out, and blue-white kind of got like a turbo blast with Narset and Teferi and all that.
Oh yeah.
So I really began growing my reputation in I started playing competitively in 2018, but really started showing up in 2019, right before COVID. Because I was always on blue whites, and locally I was already getting a name for myself by consistently top eighting all the face opens, which were back then the kind of like big events.
Sure.
Because there wasn't DRC and there were very limited amounts of PTQs. There were still GPs back then, and so I guess that was the main thing, but it was never there weren't that many that were modern. And I think Pioneer back then was just like starting out, or it wasn't really picking up much traction. And then I played my first standard PTQ for the first time, and that was my first actual ever PT qualification. I ended up winning the whole thing with a blue-white control deck that I net decked online.
Nice. Hey, ain't no shame in it. Ain't no shame in it.
And that was like during the Theros Beyond Death. I remember there was Commence the Endgame, Archon of Sun's Grace, and all that.
I remember that. Oh yeah.
That was when blue-white was considered tier 1 in standard.
Yeah. Hey, it's kind of making a comeback. It won the first challenge after the banning, so
yeah, I definitely think if
we might be talking about standard. We might be talking about standard here on the podcast soon.
Yeah, I definitely think if there was another PT in standard, blue-white would actually become like one of the tier 1 decks, because they banned pretty much all the cards that blue-white had a problem with.
Yeah, that usually helps.
Yeah. But yeah, then COVID happened, and because of that, my PT was actually online, and they changed the form. It was supposed to be modern, and that's why I did the PT queue in the first place. And then they made a standard on Arena, and I was like already so tilted from that like, I was about to quit Magic entirely.
Oh no.
And I'm glad I didn't, because then when Paper Magic came back, it was actually quite slow for me to like remake the proper deck lists that were successful. Even back like in 2022, there were quite a few people locally that was saying like, oh, you're not doing as well as you did before. What's going on and all that. And then I always told them kind of like, just wait, just wait until I get the right deck list. And now 23 is booming for me. So.
Oh yeah, patience pays off in the end. Definitely. So what currently? I mean, I'm pretty sure I know your answer on this one. What's your favorite format right now?
So my favorite format is actually modern.
Okay.
It's not Pioneer, even though my most successful format is Pioneer. I like modern the most because although blue-white is stronger in Pioneer, I feel like modern has a finer balance in terms of like the threat versus the answers, the power of each of the threats versus the power of the answers. Whereas Pioneer, I think it's much more bomb heavy. So like the threats are much weaker than much stronger than the answers.
Yeah.
So what happens is you just have a bunch of decks doing their own thing and kind of just like winning on their own because the interaction is not as strong as the threats themselves.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Follow-up question. What's the best format for Control?
Pioneer, without a doubt, yeah. So
yep. That's everybody's answer, by the way.
I don't think actually because the answers in blue-white Pioneer is the best. I actually just think it's because Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, is just such a strong card. And because there's not that many answers to it in Pioneer, relative to like Modern, where Unholy Heat for 1 mana.
I knew where you were going.
Yeah, and so I don't think blue-white in Pioneer is strong because the reactive spells in blue-white are strong. I think it's just because there's a lot of great proactive cards in traditional blue-white and Pioneer, which actually like leads me to why I ended up going into a non-counter spell version for blue-white Lotus Field.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest, I don't know if I call it criticism, but critiques of your deck list. When I first saw it, I retweeted one of your tweets of you like top 8ing or maybe of you getting second, and everybody was like in the replies was like, how's this deck not die to early aggression? There's no early game spot removal. And so that's a pretty good way to kind of get into this next topic, which is, of course, the Lotus Control deck list. And I'll pop it on screen if you're watching on YouTube or on Twitch or Facebook. You can check out this list. This is second place at the Face-to-Face Games Toronto. It was a RC. How many people were playing in this tournament? If you know.
There were 316.
Okay, so 316. So, yeah, I mean, this is the list. We've got Teferi, Hero of Dominaria as a 4 of, Wandering Emperor as a 3 of, 4 Strict Proctor, 1 Dream Trawler, 2 Shark Typhoons, 4 Doomscar, 3 Farewell, 1 Finale, a Revelation, 4 Discontinuity, 4 Memory Deluge, 2 Behold the Multiverse, 2 Jawari Disruptions. And then, of course, we have the lands of Lotus Field and Thespian Stage being the standouts. What made you want to play this version over a more traditional build? I'm sure that's one of my biggest questions about this deck. Not because I've seen this deck list. Well, not this exact one, but I've seen the Lotus Control lists popping up here and there on Moto. But what made you specifically want to play this over a more traditional, tried and true, quote unquote, tried and true Azorius Control list?
Yeah. So originally, when I was playing traditional blue, white, and Pioneer, I always ran into like some consistency issues against certain matchups like mono green or even Rakdos, where sometimes your top decks can just lose you the game. Like, for example, if you need a board wipe and you top deck a counterspell, it just does nothing. Or the other way around, if you top deck a board wipe and then you need a counterspell for the next threat, it's kind of just awkward in both situations.
Sure.
I think this is more due to the fact that the counterspells are just bad in Pioneer. There's obviously some good ones like Dovin's Veto, Ether Gust kind of. But for example, 3 mana absorb for what Pioneer is now doing, I don't think it's the right direction anymore. I think most counterspells being played should be at least at most 2 mana. Because now there's like so many decks that have a lower curve, or there's so many decks that just go over you like mono green, where you can't handle all the mana that they're generating.
Yeah.
So what I actually did originally was I was like, okay, let me try to make a blue-white traditional deck, but just with Lotus Field on top of it to try to like keep up with the mana that they were doing. So I had like counter spells like Tail's End, Disallow, and all that.
Sure.
So all those counter spells that would have been able to counter my Lotus Field, but also react to them at the same time, because you can counter the triggered abilities with Tail's End and Disallow. Then I ran into issues with like, okay, if I play Strict Proctor here and Lotus Field, my hand is full of counter spells, so I can't tap out, but I can never get my mana advantage.
Yeah, that's kind of like you. So on your turn 3, you play your Lotus Field, and then you Tail's End, and then they cast Fable the Mirror Breaker or whatever.
Yeah,
and so, like, your that's not great.
Like, Disallow and like other reactive cards, and
right.
You just can't do anything.
Right.
I ran into that issue a lot, so I was like, okay, let me just try taking out all the counter spells. They don't really do anything. Discontinuity is kind of like a pseudo counter spell if you have a lot of mana already.
Oh yeah,
and it worked wonders. Like Doomscar is such a strong card because of how you can play turn 3. That it kind of like, when I tried Doomscar over Verdict, I was like, oh my god, this card just fixes all the issues that I was having before.
Sure.
You know, like a lot of aggro decks going way too fast for blue-white to keep up, and you know, not being able to slow down the pace enough. Doomscar, it's like you play that card and then they have to play around it, or they just get wiped the next turn and they can't do anything. So either way it's a lose-lose, because they give you more time to set up, or they just walk into your board wipe.
Right.
I was like, okay, you know, there's gonna be obviously sacrifices made with this type of list. Like, I'm gonna lose extremely hard to Spirits.
Yeah.
I'm gonna lose to Lotus Combo game 1. There's no way I'm ever gonna beat that deck. But every other matchup, I was like, okay, it's pretty easy to beat most of these matchups with 4 Doomscar and 3 Farewell. That's why I never opted to play any single target removal, because of how powerful I found Doomscar was.
Yeah.
It's just, there's not that many turn 1s in Pioneer relative to like Modern, for example, with Ragavan, that you have to answer. Sure, there is against Mono Green, you want to answer their turn 1 Mana Dork, but because of the way Blue-White Lotus works specifically, where you can actually keep up with their ramp, it's not as necessary anymore either.
Right.
So every other matchup, I was like, okay, Doomscar is really putting in the work for the early game and really allowing me to slow down the game to the point where I can just, you know, play Teferi, start ending their turn and just winning from there.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think, aside, obviously, the whole absorb thing is very, you know, there's absorbs kind of not great, right? We all know that.
Yeah.
But another thing with Pioneer Azorius Control, there's no I win button. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but is discontinuity just an I win button in some cases?
If you have Teferi, a lot of the times, the first one is kind of like, okay, I'm in the lead. But then the second one is the back breaking one.
Oh yeah,
where you kind of just win from there. Because when you get to untap and have, like, for example, Deluge, Teferi, and Discontinuity,
yeah,
it becomes extremely overwhelming for them to ever try to come back.
Oh yeah.
But the true I win card is the Finale, and it's fitting for the name of the card.
Right? Yeah. So if you want to kind of explain why this card is so powerful in this deck, and I'm sure you've gotten asked, why not just play Sphinx's Revelation in this spot? But if you want to kind of explain, so for those that aren't watching and are listening, Finale of Revelation, because you might not know, is a mythic rare from War of the Spark. It is X blue sorcery. Draw X cards. If X is 10 or more, instead shuffle your graveyard into your library, draw X cards, untap up to 5 lands, and you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. Exile Finale of Revelation. So kind of take me through why that is the I win
Yeah.
button.
Yeah, so the main difference between Sphinx's Revelation and Finale is obviously instant and sorcery, but the big upside of Finale is when you get to the X is 10 or more portion. So
Yeah.
a lot of the times during most grindy matchups like Mono Green, Rakdos, what you're doing often is you're kind of using all your removal in the early game, and your deck is slowly getting kind of weaker in a sense because you're forced to play all your removal spells, your Wandering Emperors, your Shark Typhoons, and all that. This card, when X is 10 or more, basically just allows you to play a much stronger deck with already all your lands in place. So you get to reshuffle your answers again back into your graveyard and redraw everything you need to win the game from there. The biggest advantage of this card is how you get to untap 5 lands because the 5
that in my
scenario,
opinion is actually the biggest difference between this and Sphinx's Revelation.
Right?
Yeah. Because like it's so good with Lotuses, right?
Exactly. When X is 10 or more, basically what it's saying is, okay, you get to draw X cards for free.
Right. Exactly.
You get to untap all your Lotus fields, and then now you have an even stronger hand, no more maximum hand size, and you get to do whatever you need to do to win the game, like farewell the board or start doing like the Teferi discontinuity thing that many people, I think, hate, and I would never want to be on the other side of that.
Hey, now that might be a thing now, though. Now that you and now that you got second at this tournament, you're gonna have to start playing against your own deck.
Yeah, like I can just imagine the games where I'm having and I'm on the other side of it, and they tell me on your upkeep. That's the worst thing to like feel like you just cannot escape this.
I have effects in your upkeep is like one of the most terrifying things in Magic.
And especially because it was open deck list, like they knew exactly what I was doing, or when I was tapping out all my mana for Finale, they knew what was coming. So a lot of times when I played the Finale, they didn't even let me do any of it. They just scooped.
Sure. So, how often are you finaling for 10 or more?
Against Mono Green, I think I did it like 80% of my game.
Wow. So a lot.
Yeah. And there were 3 key games against Mono Green where I had actually used all my farewells, and I was able to reshuffle 2 of them back into my hand, into my deck, and I ended up drawing them and wiped his board once again. And by that point, he had he had like 20 cards left in his deck, and there was no way he was recovering from that.
So other than opponent scooping, how do you typically win the game? Like, what is the end game?
Yeah,
because obviously you can like haul them or whatever, or like beat them down with sharks or samurai. But what is the typical end game for this deck?
There's so many ways that this deck can close out the game. I'll be honest, 90% of the time they just scoop.
Sure.
Because they after a certain point of discontinuing them on their upkeep with Teferi, they see the dice slowly going up on Teferi, and once it goes to 8, there's like ult potential. There's no way they can come back from that.
You never get to actually ult Teferi.
Exactly. Like it gets to 8, you go to your turn, and they just
let's go to game 2.
So that's one of the clear ways of generally winning against most matchups.
Sure.
But
that's awesome.
For example, no, like the other times where I win, it's usually through either a hard casted Shark Typhoon or the Dream Trawler in general.
Yeah. Dream Trawler, definitely. I was playing this deck and I was like, I mean, obviously never having played the deck, who am I to critique who am I to critique this list? But I was like, Dream Trawler, all right. And then I played it and I was like, holy smokes, Dream Trawler is a nuts in this deck.
Yeah, it's definitely a high costed card, but the mana is there to support it.
Oh yeah.
So it becomes a lot stronger. And just the fact that there's not many decks playing where this card like shines in. There's not many decks that can answer this. So a lot of times it's just like you slam this and you win the game from there.
Oh yeah, this is. I mean, red black. It's really good against as long as you don't run into a pesky Liliana of the Veil. But aggro decks, I'm sure it's great against.
Yeah.
But yeah,
that's also, I think, the advantage of open deck lists, because you can kind of like gauge what their answers are to the Dream Trawler
sure.
beforehand. So, for example, if they have Liliana in the main, you kind of want to sandbag your Dream Trawler until you can actually deal with that Liliana, or you can start putting multiple creatures from Wandering Emperor or Shaq Typhoon. And
or
I think
Sheoldred's Edict they might have.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think the advantage of open deck lists for blue white, especially blue white Lotus Field, is night and day.
I don't doubt it.
At the Super Qualifier on Friday, I lost all my game once because of how it was closed deck list, and I think that it being open deck list is such a major advantage that moving forward, like Lotus Field, I think will just become one of the tier 1 decks moving on.
Yeah, I noticed whenever you finished your tournament, you said that the deck was tier 0. I mean, I've seen, like you said, the Modern Challenge the following day, I think somebody won with this. Your exact 75, I believe. And it's been popping up I've been seeing on Twitter like RCQ first place finishes. So it's definitely catching on. It's definitely very strong. I've only played it, like I said, a handful of times, and just me bumbling around with it, not really knowing exactly what to do and what hands, just from a basic Azorius Control player's knowledge. I can tell it's very powerful, and it does something that a traditional Azorius Control deck just doesn't have access to. You don't really have that I win button other than just sticking a Teferi and protecting it. But yeah, this deck it's gas, as the kids say, as the Zoomers say.
Yeah, the guy that won the showcase, Pioneer Showcase.
The showcase, yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a much more important event. There were I think 346 players in that showcase, and he won the whole thing. Probably for the first time seeing my list on Saturday, he ended up. He goes by the name Paralit.
Yeah.
Still have no idea who he is.
Yeah, I noticed on Twitter you were asking if anybody knew his Twitter handle or any way to contact him. So
yeah, because he was actually someone that I've always followed in terms of deck lists.
Yeah.
Because I knew he was just seeing his name, I already recognized him as one of the blue white control, very skilled blue white control players. So I don't think this deck is particularly easy to play.
Sure.
But I think because he already had a lot of experience with blue white in general, he was able to pick up the deck very quickly.
Yeah, that tracks. How was that? Like seeing somebody that you've followed and studied their game now start to play a list that you created and that you did well. Is that kind of a Padawan becomes the master moment? Or
yeah, it's when I found that out on the Sunday, I was already I think I was already secured for the top 8.
Yeah, I know you tweeted at me and you were like, I'm locked for top 8. I think it was the message you sent me on Twitter, and I was like, sick.
Yeah. Yeah, and when I saw him his deck list being posted the following day, I was cheering like crazy. I was
That's awesome.
having the biggest. I was just screaming out loud
that's awesome
every time, and I couldn't believe it because there were a lot of people. There's always that doubt when you play the list for the first time. where you think,
Oh, yeah.
okay, yeah, maybe I just got lucky with the matchups, or maybe I just drew very well. Maybe it's just
flash
because
in
I
the
had,
pan, flash in the pan scenario.
yeah,
Is what
exactly.
is probably what's in the back of your head. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
maybe okay, it's just I had the advantage because my opponents don't know how to play against the deck. So there's a lot of questions you ask after playing a deck for the first time and doing well with it.
Right.
Um,
You
but
still
then
doing
he just reinforced it like, okay, yeah, no, this deck it has legs.
actually insane. Yeah. That brings us, that's a great segue into my next question, which is how well do you think this is positioned in the current Pioneer metagame? You know, obviously you crushed with it at the RC, and the other person won the showcase. But now that it's kind of in the forefront of people's minds, do you think this deck is well positioned?
Yeah, so I think there's not that many direct ways to attack the deck just because of what I was saying before. The answers to the threats in Pioneer are much weaker. Um, so because of that, even for example, like Damping Sphere, it's in the end, Blue White Lotus Field is still a control deck. It's not a combo deck. It doesn't need a turn to pop off to win. It can really just grind you out slowly. And so uh, obviously people will turn towards, oh, okay, but you could just stop this mana with Damping Sphere. But then people, I don't think, realize that that's what blue white wants in general to slow down the game.
Right.
So like if you're playing Damping Sphere against me, I'm already happy because now you're kind of limiting your own spells per turn.
Right.
And if we're both casting one spell, eventually
Right.
mine are going to be more powerful than yours.
Exactly. It's like, great. Now we're just never double spelling again.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
Like,
this is exactly the game plan I want.
like against Rakdos Sacrifice, there was one match. I think it was in the quarterfinals where he had kept an extremely like hateful hand. Game 2, yeah, I think he had like double Damping Sphere and all that things to attack my deck, a Pithing Needle as well.
Wow.
But he had no pressure, so I just naturally got to 6 mana and farewelled his board. Even though I had the Lotus Field combo, like it's such a weird way to attack the deck that I don't think there's any clear way of really shutting off Blue White Lotus Field compared to the Lotus Field combo. Just because of how it can just naturally play like a regular control deck.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. But
yeah, I also think the deck has a very high ceiling, so not everyone can just play the deck and succeed with it. I think you need a lot more blue-white experience in general, just because of how in the main board you have kind of like this blue-white Tron tap-out control style.
Yeah.
And then after sideboard, you can just transition to a regular blue-white reactive deck with counter spells and all that. I think that was one of the biggest struggles most players were asking me that were trying out the deck. They weren't able to kind of transition through this play style post-side and pre-side.
Right.
And I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses, but can also be one of the biggest advantages to the deck. It's a very it can be very good or very bad depending on how much experience the player actually has.
Absolutely. So I do want to ask about a specific sideboard card here. We have Lantern of the Lost, and I didn't even know what this did whenever I saw your list. Like I saw it, just a list and without images or anything. And so Lantern of the Lost, for those that were like me and may not even know what this card is now. It's an artifact. It is 1 mana. When it enters the battlefield, exile target card from a graveyard, and then you can tap 1 and tap it. Exile Lantern of the Lost. Exile all cards from all graveyards, then draw a card. So it's kind of like Relic of Progenitus at home, basically. Why this over something like a Rest in Peace?
Yeah, so the logic of that is, yeah, it's pretty much just a bad relic. But um, I think in Blue White Lotus Field specifically, because the game plan is still such a proactive one where you can do your own kind of thing
Yeah,
and win from there with Teferi, discontinuities, and all that. Um, you don't necessarily need a permanent answer to most decks, especially
right.
because of three farewells as well.
Okay.
You just need to stall the game to the point where you can set up your hand and your board to the point where you can win from there. So, for example, against Greasefang, Rest in Peace is obviously the better card, but because of how they know Rest in Peace is super strong against them, they will board in more aggressive removal for that card. And Witherbloom Cabana is a
Yeah.
pull up in that deck.
I think every single Rest in Peace I play has gotten either Abrupt Decay or Witherbloom commanded.
Yeah. So I think the main advantage of Blue White Lotus Field has over regular Blue White is it can still win um, without having to protect your permanent answers in a sense, because there's so many win cons in Blue White Lotus Field compared to regular Blue White that you can really just play cards that slow down the game, but
Yeah.
not necessarily permanently answer your opponent's game plan, because your game plan is often stronger than theirs. You
Yeah.
just have to get there. So Lantern does a really good job in doing this, because if they try to answer it, well, you just cycle it and they get 2-for-1.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue with traditional Azorius control in Pioneer. I think you can basically have the perfect scenario and sometimes still let the game slip through your hands just because maybe you get into a top deck war and they end up top, like Red Black's great at top decking, right? They slam a Shieldred and you draw, like to your point, you might draw a counter spell when you need a removal spell, and then it just slips away. Sometimes it just happens, right?
Yeah.
I think with your list with Lotus Control, it happens probably way less. Like if you get into a top deck war, I think Lotus is probably a little bit more favored than a traditional
Yeah, like
control
my
deck.
top decks are almost all
they're
bombs,
they're
and
nuts. Yeah.
uh,
Literally every card in his deck is a haymaker.
yeah, yeah,
And I think that, so people were asking again, to go back to the question of why don't you play any early game removal, early counter spells, like Make Disappear super popular right now. My assumption after this, after our brief conversation here, would be because you want every single card to be an absolute bomb on the top deck.
yeah. That's
One
exactly
of the main reasons, right? Not the only reason, but one of the main reasons.
Yeah, that's exactly it. With this deck, because of such a like the way the deck works and how you can explode in mana advantage very quickly, you don't want uh, cheap early game removal when you're in
Right.
top deck mode. You want really the cards that can get you back in the game as soon as possible with all your mana. Um, and there's a lot of cards in the deck, for example, like Doomscar and Discontinuity, where they have kind of like cheaper costs in the early game.
Yeah.
So those cards being very flexible kind of helps the fact that the curve in this deck is much higher than I think any deck in the format.
Yeah, no joke.
Um,
Maybe Lotus Field combo? Maybe.
yeah, maybe.
Even still, they have a lot of like 1 and 2 drops. So
Yeah. But no, the deck is basically Tron game one, and the strategy is just to continue wiping the board while eventually getting so much mana that you just win the game with the mana advantage that you have.
Yeah. And another, so Jawari Disruption, and I think Strict Proctor obviously would be a terrible top deck. But tell me about Strict Proctor, because obviously it helps with facilitating turn 3 Lotuses, But how often does this ability, this passive ability that says whenever a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability to trigger, counter it unless they pay 2? Obviously, for those not in the know, you play this on turn 2, then you play your Lotus Field. You then get the option to pay 2 mana. You decline it, and then you don't have to discard or sacrifice your 2 lands. But tell me about what matchups this is good in, and what cards it just stifles.
Yeah, so just a minor detail to start. Strict Proctor, you usually play it turn 3, not turn 2, just because
Okay.
of the fact that if you're playing against a deck with removal, when you play it turn 3, they cannot answer your land drop once it resolves, right?
Sure.
Because you have priority again, and by the time you play the Lotus Field, it's too late for them to kill the Proctor.
Oh yeah, I meant turn 3. There's no way to play it turn 2. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I misspoke. That's my fault.
There are definitely some matchups where you do play Proctor turn 2, like against mono white or mono green, because they don't have any removal.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's usually a turn 3 play. But honestly, the advantage of this card is that it's, in my opinion, playable by itself just because of the effect.
Right.
And how so many decks have ETB triggers.
Oh yeah.
And it just being playable by itself and having now the Lotus Field benefit, it just makes it an extremely overpowered combo that most decks, I don't think if any, can beat that once you get it running. Strict Proctor also being a 1/3 flyer for some reason is like very strong for blue white because it cleanly blocks so many of the early game threats.
I guess because it's a spirit. It doesn't look like it has wing. Like the art doesn't look like it would have flying, but
yeah, like for example, against mono white, when they play Italia and you have Strict Proctor, a lot of times you don't really care that they have Italia now because they can't attack anyways.
Yeah.
And if they try to pump it with Talia's lieutenants, it gets countered. So it's just like such a big wall for them to get through for 2 mana that like it's so good on its own because of the stats that it has and the important ETB trigger.
Yeah.
And for example, when the Boros Convoke deck was picking up right before the RCs.
Oh yeah.
It ended up not doing so well, but I was like praying, like, oh my god, Proctor shuts down the whole deck of Convoke
right
for just 2 mana, and they just cannot recover from the game. This is also the case against, for example, Karuga Fires. You know, like Leyline Binding costing now 3 mana minimum is pretty bad. Proctor is just, if I were able to make a deck, a traditional blue-white deck, I would probably include Proctor.
Wow. Okay.
But
that's strong, huh?
At that point, you might as well just play Lotus Field.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, hypothetically speaking, if Lotus Field got banned and I were still in blue-white, I would probably still play Proctor. Not as a 4 of course, but maybe as a 2 of in the side or something.
Sure.
Like that.
Yeah, I mean, it also shuts off the Goblin Shaman, right? From Fable.
No, it doesn't. No,
it doesn't.
So how Saigas work?
I thought it was when it enters the battlefield. No.
No. So Saigas work by, as a Saiga enters the battlefield, it gets a Saiga chapter, and that Saiga chapter triggers the ability. So it's not exactly an ETB trigger.
Dang.
It doesn't stop it.
Tricky sagas.
Yeah.
But yeah, Strict Proctor seems awesome, especially in this deck. Obviously, it's like one of your worst top decks along with Jawari. But other than that, your other spells in this deck are just gas. Like even if you draw Behold the Multiverse, great, right?
Yeah.
Get to redraw.
It's very rare for this deck to go into top deck mode because of all the card advantage that it has, like the 4 Deluge, the 2 Behold, and the Teferis. So it kind of negates the okay, I have really bad top decks, because
Yeah, no, I mean, even if you go into top deck mode, I mean, I would love to be in top deck mode with this deck. There's so many cards that, I mean, every card does something, right?
Yeah.
Except for Jawari Disruption and Strict Proctor. You top deck a draw spell, you can draw. If you top deck Discontinuity, you can just end their turn. Like, it's great.
And often, I guess the deck where you're in the top deck situation the most is probably against Rakdos. And so usually around in the middle, late stages of the game, what you can do is you could just Thespian stage copy their castle Locktwing and just start drawing with their castle as well.
Nice.
That's what I've done often, and yeah, that kind of removes the top deck war situation.
Oh yeah, and you can. Oh man, that's so sweet too, because then you can steal like Hall of Storm Giants and stuff.
Yeah,
not steal, but you can copy. That's so sick.
Yeah, I've killed mono green players with their own Hydra.
That is awesome. Yeah, and the fact that you have thought distortion in the sideboard in a I mean, you look at this thing. This is Azorius, baby. This ain't Esper, but yeah. So what are the strengths compared to a traditional control deck of Lotus Control?
So I think the main strength is that it actually has its own proactive way of winning.
Sure.
Because there's no deck in the format that can come back from a Teferi and multiple discontinuities, or like a Dream Trawler and multiple discontinuities. So that being the case, I think is the biggest advantage, just because of how the format doesn't necessarily have what's the best way to put this? The format is too bomb heavy right now. There's too many threats. Every deck has like key cards where if they have it, you can easily lose the game. So for example, mono green can have like a storm.
And they always do.
And they always do, yeah.
Rakdos
can have like a very strong Shieldred, or like double Fable and all that. There's so many cards in the format that you have to not react to, but you have to answer. That having a reactive game plan with all the counter spells being so weak, it's just not great, especially with open deck lists. Like if they see you're playing 4 Make Disappear in a regular blue-white shell, they're gonna wait 2 turns to drop their bombs, and then it gets really awkward for you to answer. And if you don't have an answer other than Make Disappear, you're probably losing that game.
Yep.
Whereas this deck, it's like, okay, we got into the mid game. Do I have 6 mana? You play a spell. I don't like that spell. I'll end your turn. That happens a lot, and
it's so sick.
And
just time stop.
Yeah, it's Discontinuity is probably the best card in the deck.
Oh yeah,
how flexible it is.
I just playing it a couple matches, I was like, geez, Discontinuity is insane in this deck. And I mean, it does everything. It enables your combo, right? It enables you setting up your Lotus, and then late game, it just is an absolute haymaker.
Yeah. I don't know of any deck. There's definitely no deck in Pioneer right now that can come back from Discontinuity resolving twice in a row. I guess maybe Lotus Field combo, but after side, it's impossible for them to win to a degree because of Narset's reversals and all the counter spells. You kind of like just shift your whole deck into a regular control deck, and it's even better because you can actually keep up with their mana generation too. I think that's one of the main advantages as well, because traditional blue-white would generally have a bad matchup against Lotus Field combo because they can't keep up with the mana generation.
Yeah.
But this type of deck actually can. So it's like, okay, you're doing all this big mana stuff, but I can keep up. And if I don't like the spell you're casting, I'll just end your turn, and let's restart from there.
Yeah. Now It's like that meme. We are the big mana deck now.
Yeah.
um,
Like Dragon Lord Dramoka is a big problem for traditional blue white, but for blue white Lotus Field, you usually have 6 mana with them, and so if they
Right.
play Dragon Lord Dramoka, you just discontinuity and goodbye Dragon Lord,
Oh yeah,
and yeah, restart the game from there.
that's awesome. And then flip side of that coin, what are the weaknesses that Lotus Control has to a more traditional control deck?
Yeah, so I think blue white Lotus Field is much more prone to flooding in a sense, because of how the deck has to play 28 lands. Because basically, there can be starting hands where, for example, if you have 2 lands and one of them is a Lotus Field, that's basically a 1-lander,
Yeah,
and you
that's
can't
garbage.
keep that.
Yeah,
So because of how the deck has to play 28 lands, it can be more prone to flooding, and to the point where you cannot draw anything meaningful. That said, that really only happens against Rakdos because of how much hand disruption they have.
sure.
It
Yeah,
doesn't happen much against other matchups because of how Memory Deluge really just fixes every issue you can have. And then Teferi just gives you a free Deluge if you have Lotus Field on your
Yep.
main phase.
Yep.
That I think is the main disadvantage. I think also the disadvantage, I guess, maybe it's not a disadvantage. It's just like there are some matchups where you cannot win game 1. So, example, Lotus Field combo. I don't think I've ever to this day won a game 1 against Lotus Field combo. Grease Fang can be kind of difficult as well, but I think Grease Fang is always favored against most decks, game 1 in general.
Sure.
And for example, there's like unwinnable matchups like Spirits and Rogues.
Yeah, I mean those two matchups are hard for traditional Azorius Control as well. Like they do what we're doing, but they have pressure, right?
Yeah.
So it can be an uphill battle. I'm not sure how better or how worse it is for Lotus, but from what you're telling me, it's pretty darn bad.
Yeah, I think like traditional blue white versus Spirits is like 40-60,
Yeah,
or maybe like 45-55 depending on the blue white list.
Right.
And I think blue white Lotus Field against Spirits is like 15-85.
Ooh, that's pretty rough.
Yeah,
that's like Lotus combo versus Fires. Like Fires just cannot win that. It's like it's like 97% in favor of Lotus combo.
Yeah, like it's kind of like the matchup where you're not, if you win, you didn't really win, they just kind of lost by themselves.
Right.
So yeah, in my opinion though, having 2 or 3 bad, really just Spirits as the bad matchup, that's an easy sacrifice that I'll take any day.
Oh yeah. Awesome. Well, I mean, obviously, congratulations on your amazing performance at face-to-face games, the RC up in Toronto. That was last weekend, right?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And I appreciate you coming on. It's pretty short notice. I was messaging you during the tournament. I was like, hey, would you like to come on? So I appreciate you taking time for the podcast. Do you have any final thoughts on the deck or anything you want to say to any or any folks listening?
So I do plan, of course, there's another Canadian RC coming up the next weekend. I do plan on playing that since I had already booked my flight and I didn't think I would top 8 so quickly.
Yeah, right.
Or rather, I didn't think at all I would finish in the first seed. But I do think if, for example, I consistently do well in that event as well, then the deck definitely has is a tier 1 deck. So that will be a test that I'm willing to see if I can pull off. If I'm playing against 3 spirits in a row, then it is what it is.
Chalk that up to bad matchups and move on to the next tournament.
Yeah, but no, I would like to definitely thank everyone for tuning in. I've gotten so much interest with my deck list, and there were so many people asking me questions from around the world. Japan really went crazy, and Japan is also known as a blue-white kind of like hub for blue-white control players. So that kind of makes sense. But the last thing is I also want to thank everyone that subscribed to my Patreon. I never would have expected this much support so quickly. I had opened my Patreon Monday, and I already have more than 100 patrons.
That's incredible.
Yeah, like it's just been explosive for me this week, and I do have much more plans going forward, but no, right now I have to take it day by day, and I'm super happy with everything that's happened so far. So.
Yeah, congrats. I mean, you deserve it. You crushed the tournament. Like you said, top seed going into top 8. And I believe you lost to Spirits, right? That was your...
I lost to Spirits in the finals, and my only loss in the Swiss rounds was to Spirits.
Oh, man. Well, but yeah, thank you for hanging out. Where can people find you on the internet?
So my main platform is Twitter. You can find me at Woo, my last name, WU, Control, CTRL.
Also, I want to say, how perfect is that Twitter handle? You're a Azorius control mage with WU Control. That's chef's kiss.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like
so perfect.
The joke of like which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Right. I didn't mean to interrupt. So
yeah, no worries. That's it. I think most of the people in your podcast will have already known me.
Probably
because of my success in the recent RC.
Oh yeah.
So I guess that's it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Patrick, again for coming on in such short notice. I do appreciate it. Congrats on all your success, and not only the tournament, but also on Patreon. But heading out here, wrapping things up, we got to get some housekeeping out of the way. And like I said, thanks for hanging out, everybody. If you're watching on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, make sure to like the video. It really does help. I know I'm a broken record, and streamers and everything, and YouTube personalities are broken records, but it really does help the algorithm. If you like, comment down below, and of course subscribe for more content like this. If you're listening after the fact, please rate and review over on Spotify and on iTunes. And if you enjoy the content that I make and you enjoy the podcast, you get value out of it, consider becoming a patron. And again, thank you to all the 10 folks that that became patrons over this week. Again, I posted my sideboard guide for my lockdown control, so go check that out if that interests you. I will be updating it week to week based on how the metagame shifts and how I change my deck list, so go check that out. That's at the lowest tier, and you can go check that out, and you get access to some other things on Discord, things of that nature. And yeah, thanks everybody. If you want to chop it up with me elsewhere, you can follow me on Twitter at LessAlex over there. Join the Discord. It is an open Discord. We do have different channels for patrons, but it is open, so join the Discord. We do these every week, so make sure to save it on your podcast app. And if you want to check out some of my other work, not always control, but check out quietspeculation.com. I make pieces for them. They're hybrid video and article content, so check that out. All right, Patrick, thank you so much. I appreciate you for coming on the podcast and talking with me tonight.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thanks everybody for watching or listening. I appreciate you. Keep spreading that Azorius propaganda, and I will catch you all on the flippy flop. Adios, guys.